The new Eldar Guardians are a great update to a classic kit, adding the fidelity and options of more modern kits to the old school aesthetic of the Eldar. Today I'm going to be painting a squad of Guardians quickly and easily, using mostly dry brushing and layers in the colours of the Ulthwe Craftworld, so that you can get your squads on the table fast. There's only one recess shade and one edge highlight to do in this guide, so it's perfect if, like me, you're not a fan of spending ages on a model, but you still want to push it in a couple of areas to make your models stand out on the tabletop. These are all the paints that you'll need to paint these models. When I start a project, I like to lay out all the paints that I'm going to use, so that I can kind of see how the colour scheme will come together before I start. So starting with a black undercoat, I painted each model entirely black to get them ready for paint. I then used Mechanicus standard grey to dry brush all over the model. When that is dry, I repeated this step using Dawnstone. Dawnstone is still quite dark, so if you wanted to, you could add another lighter dry brush here with a light grey, but to get my models done quickly, I stopped here. To add definition to the black, I shaded them all over with Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a dark blue shade. If you wanted to, you could go back in with something like Fenrisian grey and pick out the edges, but my extra efforts are going to go onto the bone sections of the model, so for now the black is done. I base coated the bone with Zandri dust, making sure to do a couple of thin coats for this. There's not that much texture on this parts of the weapons, so if your paint is too thick it will show up. It's worth taking the extra time here. I then went around and filled in the rest of the base coats. I'm using quite bright colours for these, Screamer Pink for the straps, Leadbelcher for the silver details, and Ahriman Blue for all of the gems. For the faces, I started with a base coat of grey seer, which just makes the light skin tone paint I'll be using cover better than over the black. When this was dry, I used Cadian Fleshtone to paint in the skin, adding a couple of coats to build up the coverage. Thin paint is really important for the skin, as any clogging of the details can make the faces look odd, especially if you're using shades. With most of the base coats done, I move on to the next steps. These steps are in a bit out of order as I batch painted the units, but I've collected the clips here by colour, so don't worry if each clip looks like it's at a different stage. For the skin, I used thinned down Reikland Fleshshade to add some definition to the face, and then I added a quick highlight using Cadian Fleshtone again, focusing on the upper parts of the cheeks, ears and forehead. For the bone weapons, I painted Ushabti bone all over, leaving the base coat showing in some of the recesses, again using a couple of thin coats. I then thinned down some skeleton Hoarde contrast paint to use as a recess shade, painting it carefully into all of the shadows and crevices. Once this was dry, I added an edge highlight of Screaming Skull to finish off the bone. As these parts really stand out from the black, it's worth taking your time over them. For the hair, I painted each model with a different colour before shading and then re-highlighting with the base coat. I used pink, brown and blue for the hair on these models. When highlighting hair, it's worth thinking about where the light would shine off of real hair and putting your highlights there, such as around the crown. For the gems, I used Temple Guard Blue as a first highlight, painting it into the bottom left corner of each gem. For the second highlight, I repeated this with Barharroth Blue, but I also put a dot of Barharroth in the top right corner of the larger gems to simulate the light hitting them. I finished the gems off with a coat of gloss varnish. I also painted the faceplates on the helmets in the same way, using a thinned down glaze of Guilliman blue in place of the gloss varnish to add some shading to the edges of the mask. Finally, on the models, I wanted to try out freehanding the Ulthwe patterns on the heavy weapon platform. I started by sketching the interlocking lines using Zandri dust, and then went over these with Ushabti bone, making sure to leave the darker colour showing where there would be shadow to imply that the lines cross over one another. I then used Screaming Skull to highlight the points and edges to reinforce the depth of the lines, and finally used thinned down Skeleton Hoarde to reinforce these crossovers. If you take your time with this, it's quite fun and it is of course optional. With the models complete, I just needed to paint the bases. I went for a classic scheme for these bases, throwing back to the original 40k colours. I used Warboss Green to base coat in the sand before shading with contrast Warpstone Glow, and then I highlighted it with Snick Green by dry brushing. So here's the finished squad. All in all, these 5 models plus the platform probably took me about 3 or 4 hours to do, with the bulk of the time spent on the neat shading and highlighting on the bone. At about 30 to 40 minutes of painting time per model, this scheme should be fairly easy to replicate over an army, and it looks striking on the table with the contrast between the bases, the black armour and the bone weapons. Here are some size comparisons with some other Games Workshop models. The new range of Eldar stuff fits in really well with the sizes between the modern Primaris and the Guards model. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know what you'd like to see next, and please do subscribe if you found any of this useful.